Conscient Podcast, episode 206. Journalist and travel writer Arno Kopecky.
I think if we can reimagine what matters to us and pursue that, then perhaps there's a chance that we can stop this truly self-destructive pursuit of infinite more and, in material terms, become happy with enough without giving up the idea of personal growth and evolution. Because I do think that is core to what it is to be human and even just alive. Life is about growth. The history of life on Earth is one of ever more complexity and richness. And I think it would be, I just don't agree with the argument that we have to stop growing. Like, I think that's totally impossible and depressing. And I think that's often how economic arguments about degrowth versus growth get framed and understood as well. We just have to sacrifice and the good times are over and now it's just less of everything for everybody. And I guess it's kind of depressing, but that's just reality. I don't think it needs to be depressing. In fact, I think it has to not be depressing for it to work. I think it has to be exciting. And the way that I can get excited about it is to think, wow, well, let's just tell better stories and let's focus on, let's have some fun. Like let's enjoy our lives and find ways to enjoy them that can be grown. And to me, art is just the best, most wonderful, inexhaustible resource in all of its forms.
Hey listeners, this is the third last episode of this fifth season of the Conscient Podcast. I will have produced 54 regular episodes since February of this year, plus 6 bonus episodes. So that's a lot of content to digest, and I suggest you take your time. It's been a lot of fun for me, and I want to thank my guests and their collaborators for their generosity. And I'm going to take a break after the last episode, episode 208, with my daughter Clara Schreier. I'm going to breathe a bit and prepare season 6, which will start in 2025 on the theme of arts and culture in times of crisis and collapse. So, back to episode 206. You're going to meet Arno Kopecky, who is, I think, an upbeat realist. And like I did with episode 196 with Alice Irene Whitaker, which was a reviewer of her book Homing, I will read the introduction to the episode at the top of my conversation with Arno present. But before we jump in to that conversation, I want to share a quote from the episode to give you an idea of what's coming.
If I can look back at previous examples, if we look into the past, when I think of what art has done to deal with political problems, for example, or social problems, I think of civil rights, and I think of people like Nina Simone. I think of Billie Holiday. I think of Toni Morrison, and so many people like them who produced just incredible music and works of art that absolutely had a message, but also sort of transcended that message or found a way. It's so hard to put into words for me how they did what they did, but I feel like there is a whole rich body of work that emanated and proceeded from the atrocity that was slavery and racism and a clear social justice tragedy. But you didn't hear the word social justice in any of Nina Simone's songs or Toni Morrison's books. You know, you heard stories, you heard an outpouring, you felt an emotion, and that moved and transported people. And that operates on such a deep societal level. I feel like it's almost, I think art has a way of seeding social awareness and imagination And that is almost a precursor or a prerequisite for the social change that then does also require political movements and politicians and civil society and all kinds of, the realm of reason and logic and journalism and fact.
So, with no further ado, here is my conversation with Arno Kopecky, recorded on the morning of September 11th, 2024, in Vancouver. Arno Kopecky, welcome to Conscient.
Thank you. It is really nice to be here.
So what I'm going to do is similar to what I did with another book or another writer, Alice Irene Whitaker. I'm going to read you my intro while you're here.
All right.
And you can just, bear it. And then we can talk about the book and life and art and everything. So here is my intro.
Ready.
Arno Kopecky, is that right?
That's right.
A 2014 book, The Oil Man and the Sea, Navigating the Northern Gateway, won the 2014 Edna Stabler Award. Congrats.
Thank you.
Arno is a journalist and writer who lives just down the street here in East Vancouver. So I invited him to talk with me today, but also to do a sound walk after this conversation. And we'll mostly talk about his most recent book, The Environmentalist Dilemma, Promise and Peril in an Age of Climate Crisis, published by ECW Press. But I'm also curious about Arno's thought about art, the ecological crisis, and the multiple dilemmas that we all face as we work our way through the trappings and self-destructive tendencies of modernity while retaining, necessarily in a sustainable way, some of its benefits, which you talk about in your book, and we'll get to that in a minute. There are many great stories in the book, such as the dilemma faced by a boat about to fall into Niagara Falls. Should we ignore it? Should we change directions or simply accept our fate and have a drink? That one I remember clearly because, I know what I would do. So I recommend the book, in particular the audiobook version narrated by Marvin Kaye. And
That's
he's
right.
really good. And I feel like it's you when he's speaking, but it really brings the whole set of essays to life.
Oh, great. Yeah, I was really pleased with him. Thank you.
The environmentalist dilemma explores one of the core predicaments of our time. Yes, Kopecky acknowledges that our planet is dying due to gross misbehavior. However, he also observes that humanity, ironically, is doing better than ever. Mm-hmm. What's that about? I also enjoyed the book because it provided me with insights into a dilemma that I face every day: how to live well and comfortably in this world while denouncing it and rethinking it fundamentally. And your book goes deep into that, the dilemma of how do you balance those things out, if indeed it is possible. And I remember, I've told you the story, Arno, listening to the book while I was biking on my way to Victoria, and chapter 6, Let's Get Drunk and Celebrate the Future, was on, and it just really hit me, and I started saying, yes, yes, because I kind of wanted to get drunk and not deal with things, so why do I have to deal with this every day, ecological crisis and all this? And it was a cathartic moment for me, and sometimes I do feel like giving up hope and getting drunk. But then, another side of me comes in. But anyway, it was fun to have that kind of moment of connection with the oral, the recitation of the book really came into my, whatever you want to call it, energy, and it made me feel that moment and that thought of getting drunk.
If I can deliver a moment of catharsis, then that is high praise. Thank you. Lord.
All right. But as you know, it's actually a sane thing to say these things out loud. Mm-hmm. It allowed a reader like me to break through some emotional barriers that I was struggling with and find a way to get on with the work of reimagining life on Earth. And I was happy to see that the book has been well received, as witnessed by some of the positive reviews I found. Lucky you, people like the book. For example, Literary Review of Canada wrote that, in the author's hands, the book's titular dilemma emerges in all its richness, ambiguity, and tension as a foundational opportunity and challenge for contemporary environmentalism. And that's a really good summary, I think, of the book. And you question some of our most ingrained assumptions and biases with journalistic rigor and, may I say, humor, which I really appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
Another reviewer, the Ormsby Review, observed that the value of the environmentalist dilemma is this hope that though we are in some ways stuck within a system that limits our options, we can make little acts of rebellion against the system. Our little actions may add to the little actions of millions of others and maybe one day change the world, which I think is also a very astute observation of one of the values of the book. It brings us into that space of possibility. And I admit, Arno, that I've always believed that this accumulation of not only millions but billions of small-scale local actions can change the world. And in the final chapter called Every Little Thing, you talk about Czech writer and politician Václav Havel, who
Yes.
I've always admired,
Yes.
and how in that period in the 80s, it seemed impossible to change, and yet things, I guess it was the 70s and 80s, things did change. So there are, I think that we'll get to that in just a second. So
Great.
my end is, can we do this again at a global scale? Can we do that kind of impossible change, the seemingly impossible change at a global scale? So here we are. It's actually September 11th.
It is an auspicious day, isn't it,
Yeah.
for calamity and hope and rebirth.
So Arno, welcome to your first Soundwalk.
In my own neighborhood. Thank you for introducing me to home.
Well, the sound of East Vancouver, well, you tell me about the sound. What are you hearing right now?
I'm hearing some construction. There's a motor buzzing as buildings are going up and coming down. And it probably doesn't come through on the microphone, but there are some chirpings of birds. Yeah, that we were listening to. So I don't know if they're probably at the end of their summer like the rest of us and getting ready to flee the nest and perhaps travel south. And there is behind that a slight background hum of the port. We're not too far from one of the busiest ports in North America, in fact. So we're right on the edge of industrial waterfront meets quiet residential greenery. And at the moment, the industrial sounds, now I hear a float plane. So those industrial sounds are in the foreground, I would say.
So, what do you think?
Great. All right. Let's go from there. Well, thank you for that really kind and generous introduction. I don't know exactly where to begin. It's September 11th. Last night, I'm still fresh off the debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, which, again, infused me with some hope, whether or not it has any results. But it felt like an injection of sanity and reason, and to know that powerful people are fighting the good fight and articulating the right things. Environment was not high on the list. There was a brief segment on climate and environment near the end of that debate, and it was sort of a perfunctory delivery. But I also recognize there are there are some political realities that Kamala Harris has to deal with when she's talking about climate change with Donald Trump on the stage. And I just took hope from the whole thing, the idea that if Donald Trump and the Republican Party take over the U.S. government, then anything that I care about and hope for is at such immense risk. And all those things, those risks are still there if Kamala Harris and the Democrats retain office. But if they win, there's a hope that, I think they recognize the same problems I do. The Biden administration with Harris as VP has been the most progressive environmentally and in other ways, the most progressive U.S. administration in my lifetime. And so I'm, coming off of that performance last night and listening to them speak and feeling a bit of hope. And speaking of promise and peril, there it is in a nutshell.
Well, it's a good place to start, but let's actually start at the beginning.
Sure.
What is your background and how did you get into environmental issues?
Yeah, I grew up in Edmonton, the child of European immigrants. My mother's German, father born in Czech. They were both sort of products of World War II in different ways, and blown about the world through geopolitical hurricanes, and then deposited in calm little backwater of Edmonton, where my father was a chemistry professor, my mother became a teacher, and that's where I was born and raised. Middle-class white kid in a prosperous middle-class neighborhood, very boring, happy, easy life. And somehow or other, it came by the time I was ready for university. It seemed clear to me that the biggest story of our generation, of my time, and would not be one of war and, Nazi armies marching towards us, but it would be one of our civilization's relationship with the biosphere, that, the environment, which is a term I have difficulty with, but it's easy to use, and so I'll just use it here. The environment is in a great deal of trouble because of human industry and development and habitat destruction. And how are we going to manage that? Species are going extinct all over the place. One of the first news stories that I became aware of as a young man, adolescent in high school, was the collapse of the East Coast cod fishery, and that was a huge story, and then the war in the woods here in BC with Clackahoot Sound, and this huge mobilization of civil disobedience to save old growth in the 90s. That was another story that really penetrated my awareness as when I was in high school. So not out of any particular prescience or any, I was very, I think, ordinary kid, but I was gripped by this story. I loved stories. I loved to read, and gradually this story of environmental destruction really kind of grabbed me. And so I went to university and studied creative writing because I loved to read and wanted to be a writer, and also environmental studies. And since then, over the past 25 years, I have grappled with merging those two passions of concern for this beautiful earth that we live in and that shelters us and that we rely on, whether we know it or not, and finding ways to tell stories about that and about our relationship with this world we're nestled in. Yeah, here in Vancouver, we're trying to densify, which is a project I fully support. I grew up in a single-family home with a yard, but I think we're grappling as a society, and certainly here in Vancouver, with the housing crisis, and the way to deal with that is to build a lot more duplexes, fourplexes, condos, townhouses, and Vancouver's actually doing that now. We're still the most unaffordable city to live in, I think not just in Canada, but almost the world. So something has to be done, and I suppose the intrusive sounds of hammers and backhoes is one of the prices to pay.
And you wrote this book, and I came across it. I can't remember if somebody recommended it, and when I listened to it, like I said earlier, it really struck me as a very personal approach. Even though you're a rigorous journalist, it's also your story, your daughter, Disneyland, and all of these anecdotes. And at first I was thinking, and it's a series of essays, right? So one has to think of it that way. But it really very compelling and fresh to me in my ears. So why did you write this book in this way?
Sure. Well, I've always written in the first person. This is my third book, and I've done a lot of journalism over the years. And unless I'm forbidden from doing it, I try not, the story should never really be about me, but I think I can be a vehicle through which to see the world, and it's not really a tactical thing. It just comes naturally to me to write in the first person. But I can retroactively justify it by saying it feels honest to do so. And, we're living in a time where it's somewhat contentious about, who gets to tell whose story. Who speaks for who. The days when a white guy can just pop into some foreign culture and tell their stories and come back and tell his people how it is over there and what it's like to be an Amazon Indian or something. Those days are kind of over. Nevertheless, I think it's important to observe what's going on. I'm a writer. I want to tell stories. I don't only want to tell stories about what it's like to be a white guy from Edmonton. So how can I talk about interacting with different cultures and my culture in all of its different ways? It feels like, well, here's what it's like for me as a white journalist to go into an Indigenous community, for example. And here's the stories that they're telling and telling me, and only they can tell their own story, but I can tell the story of what it's like to have had that experience. And I think those are important stories. Reconciliation and our relationship here in Canada with First Nations and Indigenous communities is a huge story, and it needs to be told from a number of angles, and mine is one. Sort of a roundabout answer to your question as to what drove me to write this book in particular. You know, I had a 4-year-old daughter that has brought immense joy. She's 8 now. She's a huge part of my life. I'm mostly a stay-at-home writer, dad now. My wife is a physician. She's the breadwinner. That has, you know, when we became parents, that involved sort of a reorientation of my writing career. I was no longer going off to live in Nairobi or the Amazon rainforest for months or even years at a time. I'm staying at home here in East Vancouver, and how can I write about the world from there, from home, without leaving my house often? I did do some reporting for this, but I was grappling with how can I, you know, I've got this kid, the same old issues as always of, okay, well, here's humanity grappling with our relationship with the biosphere. Climate change is now really, and it has arrived. You know, for the first 15, 20 years that I was writing, climate change was sort of an abstract notion. We knew it was coming, but it was happening at some point in the future, often somewhere far away, like the North Pole or where these glaciers are melting. But, you know, in 2018, when I conceived this book and started writing it, was right around the time when these massive forest fires that have now, I think we're already almost accustomed to them, but the first really huge episodes of just massive fires, massive smoke, started hitting North America. And it all started to become very real and urgent. And I just was trying to think, how can I, you know, okay, how can I think about this? How can I make sense of it? And how can I, I think that was the impetus for the book, was to grapple with this stuff. At the same time, I'll just say, and you know, you touched on this in your introduction, but really a driving animus, a driving force of this book has been that paradox, so somewhere between a paradox and a dilemma, that life is really good for a lot of people, myself included. You know, we have come a really long ways from even just a century ago. And again, I have a 4-year-old daughter now. There is more opportunity available to her than there has been for most women in most of history. That feels like a huge advance. We have democracies that have spread around the world. As flawed as they are, we'll miss them when they're gone, if they're gone. We have incredible advances in medicine and nutrition and plumbing and you name it, every field of life. Even just in my own lifetime, the coffee's better, the food is better, to put it in very, you know, gross material terms. But across the board, I think, and of course there are caveats that are important, but there is a very powerful argument to be made that life is really good, and in fact qualitatively and objectively better for, you know, millions and billions of people around the world than ever before. And at the same time, we have this environmental catastrophe barreling down towards us, most famously embodied by climate change, but also species are going extinct, forests are disappearing, you know, forever chemicals are entering our waters. There's now nanoparticles of plastic in most people's bloodstreams. It feels like we are, you know, hurtling towards this huge reckoning. And so I wanted to, you know, those two truths that are in direct conflict of life is better than ever before and we are in greater risk than almost ever before. really was just running circles around my mind. And so that was, I thought, okay, that's what I want to write about, and find ways to write about that.
So let's go down an alley where it might be quieter, we'll see.
Sure.
But we might get more community life. See that we're moving now. It's the drone from the industry is just tampering down a bit, and so that feels better, right? It's like, oh.
The jackhammers are receding.
Yeah. Yeah, and sound walking is also about just appreciating all of the sounds for what they are. You know, there's sometimes sounds of children playing that I love, and all kinds of subtle, everyday, ordinary sounds that are actually quite magical and to be appreciated. Like even these planes going by. There's something about the trajectory of a plane going over space. It can be quite beautiful, you know, with long tail. And I guess that's the main dilemma, but
Yeah.
there are others. I mean, what you say, I believe to be true because I've experienced it myself. A very privileged life, just happened to be in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with energy, right? With
Absolutely.
the energy that powers.
Yes, the very cause of all of this trouble is also...
Which is a dilemma, if not a contradiction.
Yeah.
But I want to focus on the art side of the book, even though it's not about art.
Sure.
But this podcast is. And when I read chapter 6, and you talked about, and I'll paraphrase here, you talked about how we could be doing better things with their time, like songs, things that don't hurt, like songs and dance. And you were a bit glib about it, but you were very serious about how that... So maybe talk to me about chapter 6, because it's the one that really captured my attention in terms of arts and culture.
Sure, that was a fun one, the funnest one to write, and it came perhaps the easiest, I think, of all of them. So I'll just say the premise of it, I was thinking about degrowth. One of the core problems that we're dealing with is a society in which growth is paramount. Every politician, every economist, pretty much, with some exceptions, is promoting growth as a society in every way. We just need to get bigger, consume more, produce more, make more money. At both a personal and societal level, growth is this mantra that has just an iron grip on the public imagination. And for good reason. You know, it's understandable. Growth has brought a lot of good things. But there are now 8+ billion people in the world. The world cannot support that many people with our lifestyle. You know, 8 billion people can't all have a big house and a couple of cars and eat, you know, meat every single day. It's just physically impossible. And so we have to figure out a way to stop growing the way that we're growing, or to reimagine growth in some way. And I've thought about this a lot over the years. And every time I try to analyze it and write about it in a journalistic way, it very quickly becomes boring and descends into data. And I had, you know, I opened that chapter, Let's Get Drunk and Celebrate the Future. I had these 5 books that were analyzing this problem very intelligently. Each one of them was like 600 pages. They, you know, you could arm yourself with them and they'd stop a bullet for you if you needed to. And they were just so dry and so, I was like, nobody wants to read this. I can't read any of these books without falling asleep 10 times in the process. And so I just tried to, you know, throw them over my shoulder and say, look, let's just have some fun here. What I think we're grappling with is a crisis of imagination. This goes beyond the idea of growth. We need to reimagine growth. We need to reimagine what matters to us and get back to like, well, what actually, you know, what do we want? We want to have a good life. We want to be happy. What do we need for that? Yes, a minimum amount of material, but the things that make me happy are good friends, good music, good stories, good literature. Let's talk about that. Those are things that we can grow in perpetuity. You know, there's imagination and art are inexhaustible resources. And in fact, you know, they lend themselves very well to infinite growth in a way that material wealth does not. Material, you know, this earth is a finite place, but our imaginations are infinite. And that was sort of the impetus. And so I was being cheeky and having fun and saying, let's get drunk and celebrate the future. And, we can grow, we've been growing hops and barley and all the various forms of alcohol for thousands of years. I'm cautious. I want to be a little cautious here because our society also has a problematic relationship with alcohol, and I'm not trying to celebrate inebriation too much, but the point I was trying to make was, I think if we can reimagine what matters to us and pursue that, then perhaps there's a chance that we can stop this truly self-destructive pursuit of infinite more, and in material terms become happy with enough, without giving up the idea of personal growth and evolution. Because I do think that is core to what it is to be human and even just alive. Life is about growth. The history of life on Earth is one of ever more complexity and richness. And I think it would be, I just don't agree with the argument that we have to stop growing. Like, I think that's totally impossible and depressing. And I think that's often how economic arguments about degrowth versus growth get framed and understood as well. We just have to sacrifice and the good times are over and now it's just less of everything for everybody. And I guess it's kind of depressing, but that's just reality. I don't think it needs to be depressing. In fact, I think it has to not be depressing for it to work. I think it has to be exciting. And the way that I can get excited about it is to think, wow, well, let's just tell better stories and let's focus on, let's have some fun. Like let's enjoy our lives and find ways to enjoy them that can be grown. And to me, art is just the best, most wonderful, inexhaustible resource in all of its forms. It is sort of the sonic version of stopping and smelling the roses.
Yeah, and just slowing down a little bit. And sometimes you get signals like, if somebody's in distress, you could hear wailing, and then you wonder, what's going on in your community. And so there's lots of signals that are often ignored because we're scared by what they might mean, what they might imply. But I think all of life around us is important. So being more aware of the sound part is something that we can focus on once in a while through just sound walking exercise. Of course, there are basic needs that humans have to eat and to be housed, and those things obviously have to be looked after before we can have fun, because it's not much fun not having a place to live or a thing to eat. But I think that goes without saying.
Yeah.
But, in the arts sector, I've been at this podcast for 4 years now, and your episode is, I think, 206. So it's a lot of discourse about the role of art. And I think I've got it figured out, Arno.
Well, you probably more than me, because I don't spend enough time thinking about art. So tell me what you have discovered.
Well, what I've discovered is that we are art. I mean, we are living beings who tell stories and create constantly. Some are professionals who do it really well, but all of us have that capacity.
Right.
And we live in communities, and a lot of art is created with and for communities. Even though there's the genius on the hill creating a work, which is fine, a lot of art is done in a communal way, including food, including other forms of life.
Yeah.
So I think arts are essential, and as we go deeper, sadly, into the environmental crisis, let's call it that, we will need to find ways to cope with excessive heat and social disruptions, and how are we going to do that?
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm doing now is looking at the past as how has arts and culture played a role in times of crisis, because this is not the first crisis that humanity has. It's the largest, but it's not the first. And there's been extinctions and all of that. So I'm speculating on the role of the art future forward, but I'm also looking at what artists are doing now that is meaningful in this time.
Sure.
Around climate. And I've talked to some brilliant people. Next week I'm meeting a museologist, Robert James, who's going to talk about a book he wrote called Museums and Societal Collapse. And not a lot of people are interested in talking about societal collapse because, what can you do about it other than the little things that you talk about in your book and have hope and that kind of thing. But I think that it's important to find a balance point. That's why your book was so interesting, because you went into the XR land,
Extinction Rebellion. That's right.
And then people will have to read the book, so we can't tell them everything.
We'll save a couple tidbits,
But there are some interesting things that one can do to put yourself in the place of the other and to understand this growing polemic and polarity in the world, and try to go in a way of that's more conciliatory and neutral ground. And the arts tend to be neutral ground. They tend to be a place where people will agree that they like the same song, or that they've enjoyed a story, or whatever. So I'm babbling on, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on art?
Well, you know what? So where to begin? I feel like art. I was reading a Harper story about artificial intelligence the other day, and there was a line in there saying, art is the shaft of light that penetrates from the other side of the portal into our realm. I'm paraphrasing poorly there, but ultimately I do think I kind of see art as this mystical, mysterious place. And yes, we are all artists, so I don't want to be overly precious about it, but when you hear a song that transports you, or read a novel that transports you, or look at a painting that just captivates you, it sort of obliterates all political and economic and all of these very very reasonable parts of our brain. Like that part of your brain is suspended, and I think it comes from a different part of your brain, and I think that's why the best art tends to transcend political divides and even social divides and all these things. I think that's one of the powers of art. A thing that I wrestle with when I've been working on a novel for quite some time, like many writers, and I find that over time I'm really wrestling with, and have been wrestling with for years, not letting my political opinions or my propaganda seep in, and the message that I have, like, well, this is how we need to live to solve these problems, and just have it be an expression of what it is to be alive right now, without saying, well, therefore you must vote this way, or therefore you must disagree with this. We unfortunately, well, for better and for worse, learn to tune much of the world out just to survive, and I suppose stay focused on what seems to matter, and often does, but in that tuning out, and of course, we miss out.
Well, I enjoy talking to the crows in Vancouver, and I like to have a little imitative, and sometimes they look at me and say, who are you?
Yes, we all have a great relationship with crows in this part of the world, for sure. They're keeping their distance at the moment, clever creatures that they are. Perhaps they don't want to be recorded, but they fly over. They just cavort throughout the day, but every evening the crows of the city fly home to their roost, which is over in Burnaby. And so just before sundown every day, you can see a line that extends for miles. Oh, I just heard one. If I can look back at previous examples, if we look into the past, when I think of what art has done to deal with political problems, for example, or social problems, I think of civil rights, and I think of people like Nina Simone. I think of Billie Holiday. I think of Toni Morrison, and so many people like them who produced just incredible music and works of art that absolutely had a message, but also sort of transcended that message or found a way. It's so hard to put into words for me how they did what they did, but I feel like there is a whole rich body of work that emanated and proceeded from the atrocity that was slavery and racism and a clear social justice tragedy. But you didn't hear the word social justice in any of Nina Simone's songs or Toni Morrison's books. You know, you heard stories, you heard an outpouring, you felt an emotion, and that moved and transported people. And that operates on such a deep societal level. I feel like it's almost, you know, I think art has a way of seeding social awareness and imagination. And that is almost a precursor or a prerequisite for the social change that then does also require political movements and politicians and civil society and all kinds of, you know, the realm of reason and logic and journalism and fact and argument. But those things only work, you know, if you're looking at, to look at the United States today and how did they get to where they're at. I wish a lot more Americans would read a few novels and just turn off Fox News or even CNN and just listen to some music and read some novels. And I think it humanizes us and it opens us up to other perspectives and it opens us up to emotions and emotional impacts of tragedies and just takes us out of ourselves and out of our heads. And I think that's what art can do when it's at its best.
And there are many artists working on current social issues, decolonization, colonization, climate change. Many are doing that. And yet there's not a canon of work yet that I'm hearing or seeing. I'm seeing bits and pieces. We started an organization in 2021 called Scale for Art and Climate, and it still exists. Yeah. But it was hard because then during COVID, we were talking to each other and say, we need to change the world, you know, but we're sitting comfortably in our homes. Then we had to get back and make a living again.
Yeah.
And it was
right.
It was challenging, but it's still in the air that we need more art about the times in which we live. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying artists aren't doing it. I just think we need to see it more and to feel it more and to get that work into the public conscience, because as you say, you know, there are parts of the world that are in tremendous difficulty, but the standard living generally in the world is a bit better than it was 100 years ago in terms of medicine, at least in some ways. There's some truth in that.
Yeah.
But what do we do with our time? You know, that's one of the things that your book essentially asks is, what do you do? What will you do? What will be your micro contribution? It might end up being of the impact of a Václav Havel, because we don't know sometimes when we start something where it might go.
That's right.
But I think it would be interesting. I mean, this conversation go on because we're getting a bit existential.
Yes, as happens. Yeah,
I tend to be that way. But to be a bit more concrete, can you tell the story of the Václav Havel part of the book? Because I really find it's. I don't like the word hope because it's used, you know, in so many different sauces. But I think there is some power and inspiration from what happened at that time by that poet and that sense of possibility.
Sure, thanks for that. I mean, yes, so Václav Havel was a poet and a playwright living in Czechoslovakia under Soviet totalitarianism in the 60s and 70s. He wrote an illegal parable, you could call it, about a 60, 70 pages long story of his invention about a shopkeeper. He called it The Power of the Powerless. And it was really about, exactly as the title implies, you know, how can we change this totalitarian system that seems all powerful and all surrounding, and all we are these tiny little puny individuals. The moment one of us sticks our head up, it gets cut off. So we're powerless. How can we change this? And he wrote a story about a shopkeeper in this totalitarian regime. And at this time, every store in the land had to have a sign saying something like promoting, I forget what it was now actually, but it was something along the lines of, you know, we love the communist regime, or workers of the world unite, or something like that. And everybody had that sign in their shop window, and Vaclav Havel asks, why does everybody put that sign in their shop window? Is it because they really believe that workers of the world you need to unite, or is it just because everybody else is doing it and you kind of have to, and you'll stick out if you don't? And so then he imagined, well, what would happen if one humble shopkeeper just decided not to put that sign up? And that was his one little act. And then that one humble little act in this story sets off a chain reaction that leads to the downfall of the totalitarian regime. This was published in, I believe, 1970-something, as samizdat, illegal literature, underground press, distributed illegally. It became this underground hit. It went viral in the way that things could go viral in the Soviet Union back then. Very well known, and eventually the authorities found Vaclav Havel, identified him as the author of it, and they put him in jail. He spent, I believe, 5 or 6 years in jail. And shortly after he got out, it was the late 80s now, a year or two after he got out, the Soviet Union collapsed, seemingly overnight. Nobody saw it coming. And then very shortly after that, Vaclav Havel became the very first president of Czechoslovakia. And so that just struck me as sort of life imitating art in a way, and the most incredible parable. It just seemed so unlikely, and yet it happened. And our life and our world is full of these things. It struck me. My father is Czech. My last name Kopecky is Czech, so there is that resonance for me as well. It's just a really powerful story that struck me as a parable of the times we live in. When I look around now, of course, we have kind of the opposite of the Soviet Union, where we're in this tyranny of freedom, where everybody has the right to do anything and everything that they want, even though conservative forces are telling us that our freedom is under assault. I can buy as many cars as I want. I can cut down we're cutting down as much forest. We're just unlimited as a society, and in many ways as individuals, in what we can do. Limited only by how much money we have to do it, basically. But there's also no limits on how much money any individual can accumulate if he's clever and lucky enough. So that is the new trap, is this unlimited freedom twinned with this race of growth and consumption and acquisition, and we're all sort of, social media, and we're all competing, and it just seems like this. I'm not really, I have no core issue with capitalism, but so I'm not like an anti-capitalist, really. I don't think of myself that way, but I do think that we are, go ahead and try to live without a credit card or a bank account, without a certain income, without a car even, you give up. You realize, wow, I actually am trapped in this system. I am complicit in this system that is really rapidly destroying the environment all around us in 1,000 ways. And so how do I, it just feels I am just as powerless to change that system that is causing climate change and everything else as Vaclav Havel and his shopkeeper were in Czechoslovakia in 1975. And that story gives me hope and makes me think, you know what? I might not ever become president. I don't really want to be president, but maybe I can take the sign out of my window every once in a while, and let's see where that goes.
One thing leading to another, and the gesture being embodied. You literally take the sign down. It's a gesture you make publicly, but you also do it with your felt sense as opposed to your intellect, right? Because that's part of the problem, is that we're so much in our heads. I have a daily Qigong practice, and people know that because I mention it once in a while, because it informs how I live. Like, the things that are important to me are simply what is around me. The people, the more than human beings, the life that I can have as small a footprint possible. We stopped owning a car in Ottawa. We car share, which is kind of a pain because you have to reserve it and you got to go get it. But it's quite a beautiful process of being part of a collective sharing of vehicles. Why don't we all do this, right?
I just took my daughter to school in a shared in that car share service this morning.
As long as we don't get complacent that that's enough, because that is not anywhere near enough from the kind of degrowth that you talked about.
Yeah.
But it is a step and it is a process of engaging with another way of living, of sharing, of slowing down.
For sure.
Of being present. And then when you are present, then inevitably you notice things like the suffering around you and you say, well, this is intolerable. I'm going to write a book. I'm going to do volunteer work. I'm going to do whatever it is that can help and that can be connected then. Connected. Yesterday we had a meeting of Scale, this organization I talked to you about, and people were saying, I'm feeling isolated. And I said, well, you're not alone in feeling what you're feeling. It's just that we're in a period of denial or of a disempowerment. We don't know what to do, therefore we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And my proposal to people is put it on the agenda. You don't have to talk only about climate change the way I do because it's hard, but just put it there. It's slipped off. It needs to come back, and it will find its way to the center because it will become more and more urgent for us to not just deal with it in terms of solutions and alternative energy, but actually this period of madness that we're going through, beautiful madness, or I don't know how to combine. You're the balance guy, right? Who's tried to find this.
Again, really noticing that background roar. Where did that crow go?
That sounds like the name of your next book.
Where did that crow go? Where is that Fedumpton crow?
What is the name of your next book? Or not the name, but what is the general idea?
Infernal Combustion is the working title.
Oh, nice.
And it is about a man who becomes a radical environmental activist just before he dies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like redemption kind of thing?
Well, I don't know if I would call it a redemption story, but it is inspired by my father as sort of a point of departure, a man who went through his life without, he was just busy working, chemistry professor, great guy, and after he retired, suddenly had time to read and pay attention to the state of the world, and realized somewhat belatedly that there was a number of gathering crises that no one had told him about, and became a radical left-wing activist and would wear, this was, it started in the early 2000s, and so he would wear a black armband to dinner parties to represent the dead of Iraq. He was very angry at the U.S. government. He was born in Czechoslovakia but grew up in the U.S. and was sort of an unquestioning fan of the American government and their role in the world, and based largely on World War II and their defeating of the Nazis, and then later in his life came to appreciate all of the bad things that the U.S. government had done abroad. And then as part of that awareness, became aware of a gathering environmental crisis, and so became a vegan after having eaten 3 meals of meat a day his entire life. He grew up on a farm. At the age of, for him, it was 65 or 70 that he renounced all meat and started being a vegetarian and showing up at every time there was a protest or a rally. He would show up at it, and he kind of became that guy. He was hard guy to be around at a dinner party sometimes, because he would corner you and tell you all the things that are going wrong.
This is fact or fiction now?
That is fact, and so yeah, that's my point of departure. He has inspired a character that will then be dressed up in various ways, and but yeah, really got me thinking about a lot of things. Well, it's a hell of a time to be alive. It's not boring. It's very exciting, and we're lucky to be, you and I at least are at a privileged perch to observe it and participate in it from a comfortable place. That doesn't take away the existential dread and anxiety and frequently the rage that I feel when I get involved in some of the public conversations. But I'm very aware that like this is wow. Our ancestors, if they could have seen the way we live today, it would strike them as just a parade of miracles every day. Cars and planes and computers and copy machines and you name it. You know, we're in this very room. We have materials from the four corners of the world that are accumulated, and I'm speaking into a microphone, and my voice is going to be magically transported into the eardrums of people anywhere on the planet if they should so desire to listen. It's incredible. And then the conflicts are also just transfixing. The stories are intense, and it's funny how hard it is to tell these stories, but I think it is a massive untapped vein of literature and storytelling, which gets us back to art. I think, at least in terms of literature and fiction, you know, I in my book, I have a chapter where I talk about how fiction has, I should almost say had, failed to grapple with the ecological crisis and especially climate change. And one of the writers I was really drawn to was Amitav Ghosh, the Indian writer, who had written a number of very celebrated novels. And then in 2016, he wrote a nonfiction book called The Great Derangement, asking, why the hell have novelists ignored climate change? We pride ourselves in being the sentinels of the human condition and sort of observing what's going on in the world and being, you know, incisive commentators on the most important parts of what's going on. And we've totally ignored this massive existential crisis, myself included, he wrote, having written all these novels. And he himself had never written about climate change. And so he asks why and what's going on. And it's a fascinating book. And there's lots of reasons that I won't get into here. But since then, since 2016, when that book was published, I think that has really begun to change. And now there are some novels that have been published. And of course, there were a couple, and he acknowledges that before. But it was notable. And I think, you know, it is such a disorienting and strange and weird time to be alive with this climate crisis and this ecological crisis amidst such plenty, that it's this huge vein of storytelling and literature, I think, that people are just waking up to and starting to produce some amazing stories. And I take heart from that, and I'm trying to embody it myself. And it's quite exciting, I think, but it's amazing how it took this long for people to wake up to that. And it's sort of, you know, I think of some of the great literature that came out of Russia during Stalinism, from, you know, The Master and Margarita is one of my favorite novels, and Tolstoy, that was before Stalinism, but, you know, Tolstoy and all of these Russian writers who within this totalitarian grip found a way to write about the water that they were swimming in. Yeah.
Well, I've read quite a bit of literature. Some of it's on the techno-hope side of things, which I don't adhere to, and others are on the doomist, defeatist side, which I sometimes dip into,
Mm-hmm.
And find some satisfaction because it feels more real than the hopey stuff.
Yeah.
But what your book did, and get back to that, and we're going to conclude soon because we need to go for a walk.
Yeah.
It kind of takes your journalistic craft, your skills, your ethics as a journalist. So it's all fact based, right?
Yes.
You tell us, and you hit us over the head a couple of times, but you also give a hearing to other points of view, and to invite us to think about and to consider, how somebody else might feel about. And you're from Alberta, right? So
That's right.
There's that dynamic, let's call it. And yet you conclude with the story. You talk about art. You talk about the role of literature, and you advocate for a type of increasing of our cultural literacy, let's call it, literacy of our times, in whichever area people. Personally, I like some of the Cly fiction stuff. That's
Cly-fi,
because sometimes it's very dark, and sometimes it's an imaginary world that we can't imagine yet. But if we find a way to continue to be able to live together with the planet, right? Because that disconnect with nature is always at the source of, I think, all of our issues, really. Then we will, those who do survive this difficult period, because it will become more difficult before not, we'll have a sense of possibility, both looking back to traditional cultures that have always been able to sustain themselves on the planet.
Sure.
And we will have learned from this period that, wow, we can do amazing things when we have enough energy and enough food and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And what amazing things can we do with less energy and maybe fewer people, or more of a sharing, and getting out of this sort of mad consumption period where consumption is the value, where relations can be the value. And I do believe that's possible. Do you?
I believe it is possible. I've seen it somewhat in action. It's hard to imagine. Absolutely. I came into your house today with a to-go cup of coffee in my hand. I'm wearing clothes that are not 20 years old. My wife and I do have one car between us, and we live comfortable material lives. This complicity in all of this is almost inescapable. So I guess I see it as a goal to strive towards, to be less consumption oriented and more relationship oriented, perhaps, and without, it quickly becomes, it's hard to talk about this stuff without sounding like a romantic hippie, but I like music.
We are in Vancouver.
We're in East Vancouver. We are in the heartland of romantic hippiedom. So I come by it naturally, I suppose. But, let's grapple with that, and let's see, okay, well, what matters? I like to have a good time. I don't need a whole lot of material things to have a good time. Really what I need are some friends, some new people that I haven't met before. I like meeting new people. I like music. I want some literature and stories, maybe some adventure. Being a little bit glib here, but I think the project that I'm embarked on, I suppose, and that I want more people to embark upon, is to start imagining how can we find new ways of fulfilling ourselves. Because the ways that we are pursuing right now, myself included, are not very sustainable, and we are rapidly heading towards some pretty massive moments of reckoning. In fact, I would say they're already here and manifesting in a lot of the weird politics that we see today, in the smoke that comes into our windows almost every summer now, almost no matter where you live. Those consequences are here now, and this is still just the beginning. It's going to get worse in that sense before it gets better. So there's every motivation in the world to start reimagining things, and to do so in a way that is not infused with an air of sacrifice and sadness and the good times are over, but rather some optimism that actually, maybe this overwhelming anxiety and dread that we're already feeling, maybe there's a way to get rid of some of that. I think a lot of people are feeling that for a lot of different reasons, and often it seems unconnected to environmental issues. Cost of living, housing, rent, jobs, social media, image, children. I'm scared of what my daughter's 8. Pretty soon she's going to be wanting an iPhone and an Instagram account. I'm quite scared about that. So these concerns and this anxiety and these problems are here, I guess is what I'm saying. It's not just some imaginary future reckoning. It's already begun. And I think solutions that involve less consumption are a way of actually improving our lives, rather than just, reduce. Let's go for a walk. More drab and boring out of some awful necessity.
And that's a pro-arts and culture argument, and it's a slowing down argument. It's a sharing argument. Arno, let's end with what you're reading or listening to these days that you would recommend to listeners.
Oh, sure. So, a friend of mine just gifted me this awesome book called Res Rules by Chief Clarence Louie, who is the chief of the Okanagan Indian Band here in British Columbia. And it's a very sort of irreverent, hilarious takedown of the Indian Act, but also it's not what you think. He's talking about his life. The Okanagan Indian Band is one of the richest, wealthiest Indian bands. I use that word. That's what they call themselves there indigenous community, of course, and they've done really well. They have embraced a lot of the things around capitalism that we sometimes on the left perhaps denigrate. And he really extols hard work and community, and it's okay to make money. They started up a winery and all kinds of development, golf courses as well. And so he's really sort of challenging. I certainly don't agree with everything he says, but I love the way that he says a lot of it. It's fun, and it makes you sort of reimagine, oh, wow, indigenous communities can run a golf course and a vineyard and make a bunch of money. And so I think a lot about reconciliation and our relationship with First Nations. So I'm reading that. Emergence magazine and podcast is a beautiful one. I'm sure you're familiar with it, for those who are looking for fresh stories on that take ecosystems into consideration. There was one recently about the land.
Thank you, Arno.
And just all kinds of surprising stories. I'll plug my own brother-in-law, Tarun Nayar, he's a musician, and he's recently reinvented himself, and he is now known publicly as Modern Biology. And what he does is he plugs a synthesizer into plants and mushrooms and every kind of living thing you can imagine, people included, and turns their what do you call it again? You had a word for it.
Biofeedback is one of the techniques.
That's right. The biofeedback of, basically the electrical impulses in all living tissue. He fuses that into music and tells some amazing stories with it. And really it becomes, he has a meditation practice himself. So listening to him can be it's almost like a guided meditation through music and life on earth, and reimagining what intelligence and our relationship with the living world is like. And somehow he has amassed hundreds of thousands of followers and a brilliantly successful career out of this. So I'm partly envious, but also just really enjoy listening to it and seeing him when he performs. He's probably coming to a church or a park near you at some point. Yeah. How's that for a few starters?
That's good. I'll put links to those three in the episode notes so people can find them easily. And now we're going to go for a sound walk in East Vancouver, your first ever. So is there anything we didn't talk about during our conversation that you want to add at this point?
Oh, don't give up. No, I do mean that both seriously and facetiously, but I think I don't have too much to add. I really appreciate the chance to talk. I think the conversation never ends.
Right. And the listening never ends.
And the listening never ends.
And yeah. There's a crow.